The one thing they teach us in community organizing is don't be shy, take your power. And so I asked Peter Morales to come here to present to us today. Well, he couldn't do it, so he did the video. But his assistant said, I've got somebody in mind for you. He works for the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, and he's really good.
When I was coming over here, I actually flew in starting from New York City today. And as I was going through security, I have a big chunk of rose quartz that I'm carrying with me that I picked up. My sister lives in Albuquerque, and I've sort of dipped into the world of hippie and woo-woo-ness about these stones and what they mean. And security stopped me because this rock that, if you know, it's a beautiful pink rock that's about opening hearts. It's a rootedness of love. And it was also apparently a security threat. And so very early in the morning, I'm standing there yawning as security is swabbing this thing down and running multiple tests, and it's setting off more and more and more alarms as I'm trying to get here to be with you all. And I just thought that it was almost the perfect metaphor for the world that we live in right now. That a rock of love is something that causes disruptions at airports because we live in a world where love is seen as a security threat. And so I'm so glad to be here with you all as you found and launched your statewide network, a group of people who have made a history and made a promise of standing on the side of love. And you all are much more lovely to spend time with than TSA agents at LaGuardia Airport this morning. And so I think that the fact that you all are launching this network speaks to the moment that we're in, because we're in a moment where we need organizing more than ever. And organizing is for optimists. And Washington has been taken over by cynicism. Your first speaker this morning actually said a lot that I was hoping to say, so I can be even briefer than I would be before. But Washington, we talk about broken laws, especially with the immigration system. We say the immigration system is broken. But the truth is, to me, Congress is broken. Washington is broken. Putting politics before people is a broken system that's ruled by a cynicism of these, what you all probably know even better than I, campaigning before policy, political careers before personal connection. And it gets paraded through here every 4 years or so, if not more, at this point in our world of permanent campaigning, no? When Hillary Clinton was here a week or two ago, there was a young undocumented woman, and she introduced herself to her, and she said, Secretary of State Clinton, I'm a dreamer, undocumented young person. And Clinton said, yay, gave her a cheer, because dreamers we hold up as an icon in the immigrant rights movement. And she said, what do you think about the fact that the president just decided to delay his relief from deportations? And she said, I think we need to elect more Democrats, and then quickly moved along. And so we saw the cynicism of this moment, that I'll celebrate you as long as you fit within my narrative. But the second that it becomes about the feelings you have when you go home at the end of the night, it becomes about politics and careers and elections again. And so in Washington, I think we see that there's an inability to lead, that people on the ground in every city, in every town, are filling that example in that leadership vacuum that we have. There's an inability to feed people despite abundance. There's an inability to place our planet before profit despite the threat of climate change, despite the threat of disaster that's ahead of us. There's an inability to create peace despite all the connections we have across the globe. And so at this stage, I think that we as humanity can do better. I don't believe that we can create tools that put all the information of the world at our fingertips, but we can't put food on every table. I don't believe that we can connect a global economy that can move markets and merchandise and commodities from one country to another within hours, but we can't figure out how to do that for people who cross borders and move from one country to another. I believe that we live in the illogic of a time where we have homeless people and peopleless houses, and we can't figure out how those two things can match. And I believe that we can do better. And I think that's where organizing comes in. And I think that's where statewide networks like yours comes in. And so especially in Iowa, talking with an organic farmer before I came up on stage. I worked in Maine on a 1-acre hobby farm, even if you would call it that, for one season. And when we talked about organizing, we cited things like when we had to irrigate the field. And so we would create a human chain of buckets from the pond that we had to the field that we had. And there was 1 or 2 stubborn people who would pick up their 40-pound, 5-gallon buckets and struggle themselves over to the field. But the rest of us would pass them lightly from one hand to another. And in organizing, we say, isn't it easier when we work together instead of against each other? Isn't it easier when we collaborate instead of compete? And so organizing, too, rewrites history. It takes the people who have been invisibilized, it takes the people whose suffering we're told to ignore, and it puts them center stage. It challenges the narrative that the world gives us that our problems are too big for any of us to solve. That problems like climate change, that your role can be reduced to a recycling bin, and you should draw a curtain around the chemicals that farmers nearby are using. It shames us, saying that because of who you love, or because of where you're from, you're less than human. And it says that if you have some form of suffering, if it's hard to pay the rent, if it's hard to get your child through school, if you lose your job, if you can't make ends meet, the world tells us that in one way or another, it's our fault. It's something that you did. And organizing shatters those myths. Organizing says that the personal is political, that the problems that we face are systemic, that there is a root cause that's beyond your individual life. Organizing tells us that there are alternatives that are possible. The world would like to tell us that this is the way it is. Again, the cynicism of the reality of now, that we know things are bad, we know injustice exists, but we don't believe there's an alternative. Organizing says that the alternative is possible, that another world is possible. And the third thing organizing does is it tells us that we can be part of creating that possibility. We can be part of making that alternative real. And we see it everywhere, every single day. You see it in a state of Iowa where an HIV law gets overturned and rewritten so that people don't have to compromise their dignity and don't have to go through the persecution that comes with the stigmatizing that law was about. You see it in the fight for 15 in towns across the country where minimum wage workers are saying that I may work in a McDonald's, I may work in fast food, but I'm a human being that deserves dignity, and it's just not possible to live on the wages that are available to me. And in fact, I heard earlier that 67% of people in Iowa support a minimum wage increase or a living wage. And so organizing takes that majority that exists, even if the political will isn't reflected by electeds, and changes that equation. In our campaign, the Not One More Deportation campaign, we take a conversation around immigration that's more comfortable talking about the economics, that's more comfortable talking about fruit that's rotting in the vine than it is about the human cost. And we say that this is actually about human dignity. And we start from that place. It's about real people, real lives, with real stakes. And so in the past year, as we fight for immigration reform, as we fight for the president to change his policies, there are individuals who are coming out of the shadows, who are saying, I have the right to remain, that I've built my life here, that I've contributed to the communities that I live in, and I'm not leaving despite your deportation order. And we've built a movement across the country to stop them from removing our fathers, our neighbors, our loved ones, and instead starting the process of inclusion, starting the process of citizenship by saying that it's based on not just what papers you have, but what participation you have in the political system. And that's where change starts to happen. And so nowadays, when we hear organizing, we think of professional community organizers. We hear our president was an organizer, but it's not a profession. It's something that communities do every single day. It's something that's organic. It's something that happens when you believe that we're interconnected. It's something that happens when you reject the lie of separation, where you are you and I, and there's nothing that relies between us, that I can be injured and you can't be harmed. Organizing happens when we accept what Dr. King said, that an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. The old adage that an injury to one is an injury to all. I do body work on the side. I do massage. And I've been learning on a molecular level, when the skin is injured, it actually sends out ions to the skin around it that sends an injury message, and the molecules around it activates a healing response. And I wonder if that's what happens in our bodies when we're physically injured. What happens in our communities? What happens in our towns when we face an injustice or we face a wound, or when someone sends out a message of injury? Do we activate our healing response? And it doesn't mean that we need to be doctors to be able to do that healing. It doesn't mean that we even need to know what to do. Bob Moses, who was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, when he talked about taking on segregation in the South and the exclusion of the vote, he said, we didn't know what we were doing. We were taking on hundreds of years of the legacy of enslavement. We were taking on Jim Crow. We were taking on the most entrenched political system that there was. So we bit off a piece that we thought we might be able to handle, and we saw where it led us. Ella Baker said that strong people don't need strong leaders, but that the role of a leader is to develop the leadership in others. And I didn't grow up thinking this way. I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up seeing examples of leaders, and I was trained to be one like them, well-educated and on a trajectory of success. But my sister met a nun, Sister Diana Ortiz, who was tortured in El Salvador. She had cigarette butts extinguished on her skin. And the person who was instructing the people to do that was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and had an American accent. And so I hear my sister come home from meeting this tortured nun, and I hear about the role of the US in her own suffering, and I think, with all the education that I have, with the investment that's been made in a young person like myself as a potential leader of tomorrow, how is it that I didn't know that this happened? And how is it that this is happening in my own name? And in that moment, I realized that there are two sides to history. There's the history that's told by the hunter, and there's the history that's told by the lion. And as long as history is told by the hunter, it's never going to include the lives of the lion. And so, as Howard Zinn said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. History is moving. And are we either derailing or moving the train towards justice, or are we going along and accepting the suffering of others? I also was going to quote Archbishop Romero, a name that was brought into the room today, because I heard his speech where he said that it's unjust to have more than you need when others have not enough. And so I think the question for me is, for those who have received more, for those who have had opportunity, what do you do with that that's been invested in you? What do you do with that that you inherit? Who and what do you serve? And for me, the poet Marge Piercy has a poem, To Be of Use, where she says that her people are like the ox that attaches itself to the cart. Her people are the people who go out in the field and bring in the harvest. Her people are the people who seek to be of use. And Bernadine Dorn, because I live in Chicago, the former weatherman, she says that sometimes we have to lead by getting out of the way. Sometimes we have to activate our compassion, what Walter Brueggemann describes as letting your innards feel the suffering of someone else. And my father and his wife are part of a Catholic study group called Just Faith. And they shared some of the readings with me, and they said that one of the pillars to doing justice work is being in proximity to the poor. Because it's in proximity, it's in relationship that you create the impetus for change. And it's in isolation and it's in distance that dehumanization can happen. And so I think about Malcolm X's quote where he says, "Careful what you read in the newspaper, because they'll have you hating yourself and loving those who hurt you." And tomorrow I fly to Portland, Oregon, where there's a day labor leader. He's a singer, he's a wage theft recoverer, he's an organizer, and he's a father. And 5 days ago, he took sanctuary in a church because last Friday, ICE agents came to his door looking for him. And the community has rallied beautifully around him because he has decades at this point of working for justice. But what the news has reported is that 15 years ago, he was convicted of drug charges and deported. And 2 months ago, he was driving home from a party and he got a DUI. And he's in a diversion program. And if he was anyone else, if he was born within these borders, he'd be like anyone else, getting on with their lives and have an embarrassing story that they hope that they don't tell. Like anyone else, he has mistakes that he made in his teenage years. But if we have distance from the people that are reported on in the news, their humanity gets reduced to a charge. Their humanity gets reduced to a sentence, and the mythology of a threat allows us to permit their suffering to continue. Whether it's the war on drugs, whether it's the war on terror, or whether it's the war of attrition against immigrants, all of them are wars that have denied people their humanity. And so Unitarians have very strategically placed yourselves at this intersection of fighting dehumanization, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's the fight for LGBTQ equality, or whether it's the fight for immigrant rights. At every turn, what we're doing is we're affirming the full human dignity of a human being and saying it can't be reduced to a stigma. It can't be reduced to a charge. And so as you all walk that path, as you start to coordinate in strategic ways, you've had victories. You've had a taste of what you can already change. And we know that in this moment, we need to do more. We're called to do more. And it requires us to take not just each of our individual work, but to pool our resources, to pool our energy, and figure out with our priorities and with our voice, how can we make the most change, both on a statewide level, and then how can you all create examples, despite what I heard you all saying about your governor earlier, that actually lead the rest of the country in another direction. And so while Washington is built to disempower, it's large marble hallways that make you feel small. It's alien processes that make you feel confused about how to advocate for yourselves. In our neighborhoods, in our congregations, and in our towns, we have the ability to move mountains, or maybe planes. We've seen it in the past couple years. The response to Trayvon Martin's murder, the response to Eric Garner in Staten Island, the response to Mike Brown, to say that Black Lives Matter. We saw it last week when 500,000 people marched through New York City as an alternative vision for what we should be doing with our earth. We see it in jurisdictions across the country despite the inaction on immigration in Washington. 250 jurisdictions across the country have moved their police to say that when ICE comes knocking and asks us to hold someone for extra time solely so they can be deported, we're letting that person go like anybody else. Because we believe in equal treatment, because we believe in public safety, and we believe that if our own community sees us as deportation agents, we lose their trust. And so we would rather collaborate with our community than collaborate in a deportation dragnet. And that's what's happening on the ground. When we look to Washington, we see a story of dismay. But when we look at each other, I see nothing but a story of optimism. And that's the basis, again, for organizing. And that's the moment we're in as you all launch this network. And so I've always been honored to walk the road with the Unitarian Universalists, and it's a deep honor to be invited to come and be part of this event with you all. And I can't wait to see what you all are going to do. And us at the National Day Labor Organizing Network pledge to be there with you, support you, and hopefully we can make a lot of trouble together. Because as I was looking up quotes, I saw the quote that when the government fears the people, you have liberation, or you have democracy. When the people fear the government, you have tyranny. And I hope that we can be a lot scarier than we've been so far to this government, so that we have a much stronger democracy and a much deeper freedom. Thank you.